As an old Carthusian, I arrived here in the early 60s, and I arrived at a rather draconian, I would say, 18th century, perhaps 19th century sort of setup. I think public beatings, if I may say that, in the schoolhouses were prevalent, or at least about 3 a week. There was no question of progressing, and the so-called the 60s revolution hadn't arrived at Charterhouse at all. So what a perfect setup to have the opportunity to become creative, to let those juices flow, because this was a place where you were meant to be very academic, very sporting, and if you had any kind of musical ability, it had to be one thing only: totally and utterly classical. And so was born a rather musical talent. I think we all know Tony Banks, fantastic musician. What a training he had. But we were wanting to express ourselves. And the only way we could do it, bluntly, was a bit of long hair. And, well, we did actually, we wore drain-pipe trousers. We did. And teachers would go around measuring those trousers, because if they were under a certain number of inches, you were in trouble. And that was much more important than what you felt about the future of the world, what contribution you could make to the world. That was all secondary. So, in this 19th century institution, a number of us arrived. And I'm glad to say there were some musical talents. There were 2 bands that were formed in the course of the early 60s here at Charterhouse. One was called the Anon, short for Anonymous, and I'm very, very delighted.
Have remained so.
That on my right, you may recognise someone, Richard MacPhail, an old Weekite. Richard was part of that band, and I'm going to let him reminisce in a minute. The other band was known as Garden Wall, and in that band were another number of very eminent musicians. And in the course of a number of years, these 2 bands got together and actually played a gig here at Charterhouse in the main part of the old buildings here, Great Hall, and Richard will reminisce about that. And so it is fantastic tonight that we can have here at the Ben Travers Theatre, which wasn't here in our time, was it, Richard? But we have a super opportunity to relive and remember some of the musical talent that was created out of that revolution. Richard, can I ask you to just reminisce a little bit, to tell us how Anon was started and how it formed and how it developed?
Yes, thank you. Good evening. Anthony Phillips and Rivers Joe began Anon basically, I think they were called the Spiders, at a prep school outside Hindhead called St Edmunds. And I actually met Anthony before he came to Charterhouse. For some, I won't go into the details, but for some bizarre reason Rivers got the idea that I was a drummer. So he took me to Ant's house and in Putney in southwest London. And it soon became evident that I was not a drummer, but fortunately I knew the words to one of the Rolling Stones songs that we were going to be playing, and that's how I became the singer. And we got in a really good drummer called Rob Tyrrell, and that's basically how Anon got started. So we would spend our spare afternoons and weekends trying to persuade various more liberal, if I can use that word, teachers, beaks, as some of you may know, I think, to use their classroom and make a dreadful noise, and with our paltry collection of amplifiers and bits and pieces. Ultimately, this all in the summer term of cricket quarter, of the end of that. Do they still call it the cricket quarter?
I hope they do.
Why, when there's only 3 of them in a year, they call a quarter is always. I never really got my head around
that. Was Charterhouse logic.
We put on this thing called the Beat Concert under the wing of Geoffrey Ford, who was responsible for all the music at the time. And Garden Wall played a set, and we played a set, and then so we...
Richard, can I just ask you to tell us who was in Garden Wall?
Oh, Garden Wall was Peter Gabriel and Tony Banks and Ant Phillips. He seemed to pop up in all the bands. And Chris Stewart, who was the original drummer of Genesis, who's found fame later as a writer. He wrote a book called Driving Over Lemons, about being a farmer in the south of Spain. Is it my eyesight, or did the lights just... I can't tell these days.
I don't think they've paid the bill recently.
And if you haven't read Driving Over Lemons, I strongly recommend it. It's an extremely good book. It's very amusing. And, it's on fire. I was just one little vignette I wanted to tell you about this concert, which was that we planned... We were incredibly disorganised and not nearly well rehearsed enough, but that's how you learn these things, that's what you're doing. And the last song we were going to do is an Otis Redding song called Shaq, which was covered by a band called the Small Faces. And all we had done is gone to the record store in the Record Corner in Godalming, Godge, and listened to it they used to have listening booths, and we persuaded the girl to play the thing 3 times, which was like way over the limit. And that is how we had learned the song. I'm sure Anne knew the chords very well, but we hadn't really rehearsed it. And to cap it, it's going to be our last song, your big climax song. So it just shows how incredibly naive and disorganised we were. The one condition that we were allowed to do this concert was that none of us could make any announcements. Geoffrey Ford was worried that I was going to kind of stir up a revolution, kind of Lindsay Anderson's If style, if any of you have seen that film, which was very reminiscent of
amazing
the
film.
place that we were. It really felt like it was. And so we were about to do our penultimate song, and we had an equipment breakdown, something that dogged us, and later in Genesis years did a great deal too. And I'm standing there with, I've got to say something. So I said a little bit of an announcement about the song, which happened to be a song called Pennsylvania Flick House that Ant Phillips wrote, and it was our first sort of original song, and all the rest being covers. So we played the song, and afterwards Geoffrey Ford got up and pulled the plug. He stopped the concert, and it was the whole thing ended in an incredibly sort of damp squib. But in fact, he saved us from huge embarrassment of having to play Shake that we hadn't really prepared at all. So it was strange the way it worked out. And then in later years, as I say, in the early days of Genesis, we could never afford any decent equipment. It's one of the big differences about this kind of band is that the equipment nowadays is so much better and it sounds so good. And often things would break down. I was very, very, I was no good at soldering, and so I really shouldn't have been doing it. But anyway, I was the only one who was prepared, and so leads would break and stuff, and it very much led to the same thing. Peter doing these very long announcements, and he developed these incredibly intricate, wildly fantastical stories between the songs, which sort of became a tradition of the band.
It certainly did. So how did the two bands finally get together?
By dint of the fact that Rivers Joe and I left the school and went to continue our education, if you can call it that, elsewhere. And basically Ant and Mike and Peter and Tony got together, and that was the genesis of Genesis. Initially, they wanted to be writers, and they didn't want to perform. And I even remember a suggestion later of the band playing behind a black curtain, because they didn't want their, personalities to sort of impinge on the music. It was very, very pure music. And it's ironic that in the fullness of time, they became one of the best live bands ever in terms of just the show and the presentation and a lot of the stuff that you're going to see tonight.
So there was this period of having left Charterhouse, say around 1966, there were those so-called missing years. Could you tell us something about that before they became the megastars that we know of today?
Well, there was a lot of music writing and rehearsing going on during those years. Basically, the band would make their way round to various people's homes in the country and make a dreadful noise until the other occupants of the homes insisted that they moved on. And the whole thing kind of came together in the autumn of 1969. I, in the meantime, had done what would now be called a gap year or two, and everybody was essentially set up to go to university. Peter was going to film school. He could have ended up as a film director. God knows what his films would have been like, but I'll leave you to imagine that. But so my parents had a cottage just this side of Dorking. Turns out to be right next to where you live.
Yeah.
And they were going to sell it, and they wanted to wait till the following spring. So, in a moment of absolute madness, they lent us the cottage, and we did the thing that bands used to do back then, which was get it together in the countryside. And at the end in the spring of 1970. We got a contract with Tony Stratton Smith and Charisma Records and recorded Trespass. And we were very fortunate that Charisma also had a band called Lindisfarne, that you may remember, Fog on the Tyne and all of that, who were hugely successful, who fortunately provided vast amounts of cash that Tony Smith then sank, never to be seen again, into Genesis, because the band needed a lot of support for many years before they finally broke through, but I guess it became good in the end.
I think they certainly did. One of the interesting things that I remember Mike Rutherford telling me was that he actually had to temporarily disappear from the music scene at Charterhouse because his housemaster confiscated his guitar, and that there was no way that he could find any other guitar, and that you yourself had some torrential pressure to stop being the lead singer of an on.
Definitely. It's what you said. It's because we weren't playing Beethoven string quartets. You know, that we had tremendous pressure. Well, certainly, my parents were very strongly against me pursuing this. And there's a program that exists of a previous show that we'd done where we did 3 Stones covers, and in the hall before the Beat concert, where my name is not on the list because at this point my parents had refused for me to perform, but actually I got them to relent, and we did do the show.
Final memory, to escape the institution, some of us used to go down to the local pubs because that was a way of expressing yourself and having a beer and perhaps a couple of whiskies. And if we found a young teacher in that same pub, the etiquette was quite clear. You had to buy the teacher a drink so that he didn't sneak on you and gate you, which means that you wouldn't be able to leave your house at all for the rest of term. It was as tough as that, but it has created, as you will know, one of the greatest bands the world has seen. Genesis will go down as one of the very greatest, and it's fantastic that this evening we've got the opportunity to see a tribute band that have not just taken the trouble to study the music of Genesis, but also to investigate, develop, and take it upon themselves the theatrical side of Genesis. And so you are going to have a very special treat this evening, because you are going to see the book of Genesis perform the real thing. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.